There was a time when Fifth Avenue did not look like it does today. Before the glass storefronts, before the luxury brands, before the traffic and tourists and polished windows, there were mansions. Not ordinary city houses. Not quiet brownstones tucked away on side streets. These were private palaces, built by some of the richest families in America, at a time when New York wealth wanted to be seen, respected, and remembered. They stood behind iron gates and heavy doors. They had stone fronts, grand staircases, formal dining rooms, private galleries, and ballrooms made for a world most people would never enter. Some looked like pieces of Europe placed in the middle of Manhattan. Others were designed to make a simpler point from the sidewalk. The family inside had power, taste, and a name that mattered. And then many of them disappeared. Fifth Avenue's palaces were destroyed. Old New York was erased. And the reason was not a fire, not a war, and not one single disaster. In many cases, the land beneath those mansions became more valuable than the mansions themselves. That is what makes this story so strange. These houses were built by people who had almost everything money could buy. The Vanderbilts. The Astors. The Carnegies. The Fricks. Families tied to railroads, industry, banking, art, society, and old New York power. They could hire leading architects. They could import materials. They could fill rooms with marble, carved wood, paintings, tapestries, and furniture made for another age. But even that could not save many of their homes. Because in New York, a building can be beautiful, expensive, famous, and still not be safe. Today, if you walk along Fifth Avenue, the loss is easy to miss. The avenue still feels wealthy. Money is still everywhere. But it is a different kind of wealth now. It moves through stores, offices, hotels, apartments, and brands. It does not stand still for long. More than a century ago, parts of Fifth Avenue were different. The avenue was a place where rich families tried to build something that looked permanent. Their homes were not just places to sleep and eat. They were public statements made in stone. A mansion told people where a family stood. It told visitors who belonged in society and who did not. It told rivals that one fortune was larger, older, or more impressive than another. But there was a weakness hidden inside all that grandeur. The very street that made these palaces powerful also made them vulnerable. Fifth Avenue was one of the most desirable addresses in America. That made it the perfect place for a palace. But as New York grew, that same address became too valuable for one family house to occupy forever. A palace that once looked like a triumph began to look like a question. Why should one family keep an enormous house on land that could hold a hotel, a store, an office building, or an apartment house? That question did not destroy Fifth Avenue overnight. There was no single day when old New York disappeared. The change came one property at a time. A family moved. An heir sold. A house became too expensive to maintain. A developer saw a better use for the land. And once that happened, even the grandest homes could fall. So the question is not simply, where did the mansions go? The deeper question is this. How did some of the richest families in America build homes meant to last for generations, only to see so many of them vanish within a few decades? To answer that, we have to go back to the world that built them. A world of money, rivalry, status, and ambition. A world where Fifth Avenue became more than a street. It became the place where America's richest families tried to prove they were not just rich. They were permanent. And that belief is where the trouble began. Before Fifth Avenue became a street of vanished mansions, it was a stage. In the late 19th century, New York was filling with new fortunes. Railroads, banking, shipping, steel, industry, and real estate were creating families with wealth on a scale America had rarely seen before. But money alone did not always bring respect. In old New York society, there were rules. There were guest lists. There were names that opened doors, and names that were still being judged. A fortune could buy land and stone, but it could not automatically buy acceptance. So the richest families built their argument in public. They built mansions. On Fifth Avenue, a house was not just a place to live. It was a message to the city. It told people a family had arrived, that it belonged, and that it expected to be taken seriously. The front of the house mattered. The staircase mattered. The dining room mattered. The ballroom mattered. The art on the walls mattered. Every detail helped send the same message. This family had wealth. This family had taste. This family belonged. And few families understood that better than the Vanderbilts. Their fortune had grown from transportation and railroads, and by the late 1800s, the Vanderbilt name was one of the most powerful in America. But in New York society, power and acceptance were not always the same thing. So the Vanderbilts built on a grand scale. Their mansions did not ask politely for attention. They demanded it. They were large, expensive, and placed where the city could not miss them. Fifth Avenue became the place where the family could turn money into visibility. One of the clearest examples was the Vanderbilt Triple Palace at 640 Fifth Avenue, completed in 1882 for William H. Vanderbilt and members of his family. It was more than a single residence. It was a family statement placed directly on one of New York's most important avenues. A house like that had a purpose beyond comfort. It told the city, this family is not passing through. The palaces of Fifth Avenue often borrowed from Europe. French chateaux, Italian palazzi, and old-world styles gave American fortunes the appearance of age. That choice was not accidental. Much of the money was new. But the houses were designed to look established. That is one of the most revealing parts of the Gilded Age. These families were building a new American elite, but they often dressed it in the architecture of old Europe. They wanted homes that looked as if they belonged to a long history, even when the fortunes behind them had been made in a much newer world. The result was impressive and beautiful. But it was also deeply competitive. Each mansion raised the stakes. A larger room. A more dramatic entrance. A stronger facade. A better address. A louder signal to society. Behind the elegance was rivalry. Behind the stone was insecurity. That is the turn that matters. The houses looked confident. But many of them were built from insecurity. If a family's place was fully secure, it might not need to prove so much. But Fifth Avenue's palaces were built in a city where rank could be questioned, challenged, and measured. The mansion became a way of answering before anyone asked. It said the family belonged. It said the fortune had taste. It said the name would last. But no house could truly promise that. A mansion could impress guests. It could make newspapers take notice. It could make a family visible from the sidewalk. It could help create the image of permanence. But it could not stop New York from changing. And that was the weakness hidden inside the grandeur. The families built these palaces on Fifth Avenue because it was the right address. But the more important the avenue became, the more valuable the land became. And the more valuable the land became, the more pressure would eventually fall on the private houses that occupied it. At the time, the danger was not obvious. The mansions were new. The families were powerful. The avenue seemed to belong to them. For a brief moment, Fifth Avenue looked like proof that American wealth could make itself permanent. But that was only the surface. Underneath, the city was still growing, still moving, and still looking for the next opportunity. And soon, the first real pressure would reach the gates. The first threat to Fifth Avenue's mansions did not arrive with a wrecking crew. It arrived quietly, as business. For years, the great houses stood with confidence. Their doors were closed to most people. Their windows looked out over an avenue still known for wealthy families, formal households, and private power. But New York was changing around them. The city was growing. Business was moving north. Hotels, clubs, stores, and commercial buildings were beginning to look toward the same avenue that had once belonged to private mansions. And that was the first crack. Not a crack in the stone. A crack in the reason for keeping the stone standing. A Fifth Avenue mansion had once been valuable because of the family inside it. The address meant status because the people behind the doors gave it status. But as the city changed, the land itself became the prize. That shift was dangerous. Because once the land became the main attraction, the house on top of it had to justify why it should remain. A mansion could still be beautiful. It could still be famous. It could still carry the name of a powerful family. But if a hotel, store, office building, or apartment house could make better use of the property, the old mansion became vulnerable. This is where Fifth Avenue began to change in a way the old families could not fully control. The palaces had helped make the avenue desirable. But once the avenue became desirable enough, other forces wanted in. Stores wanted the prestige of the address. Hotels wanted access to wealthy visitors and uptown social life. Developers saw that Fifth Avenue was no longer just a place to live. It was a place to make money. That change did not destroy every mansion at once. It happened slowly. A new business appeared nearby. A private house was sold. A block became busier. The old quiet faded a little more. Then another building changed. And another. This is how a neighborhood can lose its character before the buildings even come down. At first, the mansions still look secure. The gates are still there. The stone walls still stand. But the world around them has started to move in a different direction. And once that happens, a private palace begins to feel less like the center of the street and more like something left behind. For the families of Fifth Avenue, this created a problem that money alone could not easily solve. A large mansion required staff, upkeep, repairs, taxes, and a whole way of life to support it. It made sense in a world of formal entertaining and private society. But as the avenue became more commercial, that world became harder to maintain. The house had not moved. But the street had moved on. That is the turn that matters. Fifth Avenue did not suddenly reject wealth. It remained one of the richest streets in America. But the kind of wealth it rewarded began to change. Private family wealth was giving way to commercial wealth. A mansion behind closed doors was no longer the only symbol of success. A department store, a hotel, or a luxury business could also display power, and could often do it more profitably. These houses had been designed for privacy, ceremony, and family prestige. The new avenue wanted movement, customers, visibility, and return. The two worlds could exist side by side for a while, but not forever. Sooner or later, a question would come to each mansion. Should this house remain? Or should this land become something else? That question was the beginning of the end for many of Fifth Avenue's palaces. The danger was not always obvious from the sidewalk. A passerby might still see carved stone, tall windows, and a grand entrance. But behind the beauty, the mansion's position had weakened. Its value as a family home was now competing against its value as real estate. And in New York, that is a hard fight to win. The old families had built on Fifth Avenue because they wanted the best address. But the best address eventually attracted everyone else. Commerce followed prestige. Development followed commerce. And once that chain began, the private mansion world had very little room to breathe. By then, the mansions were still standing. But for the first time, New York could imagine Fifth Avenue without them. And once New York could imagine replacing them, the next step was only a matter of time. The strongest proof would come from the family that had built some of the grandest mansions of all. The Vanderbilts had used Fifth Avenue to show that their name belonged at the top of New York. Now Fifth Avenue was about to show how little even that name could protect. The fall of Fifth Avenue's palaces can be told through many houses. But the clearest story belongs to the Vanderbilts. No family made a louder statement on Fifth Avenue. Their mansions were not built to be quiet. They were built to be seen, discussed, admired, and remembered. They stood as proof that the Vanderbilt name had climbed to the highest level of New York society. And for a while, it worked. Their houses gave the family a physical presence on the avenue. They were not just rich in newspapers or bank accounts. They were rich in stone. Rich in rooms. Rich in staircases, galleries, gates, and addresses that told the city exactly where they stood. But the darker truth is this. The same avenue that made the Vanderbilts look powerful would later prove how little even their power could protect. The most haunting example was the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house at 1 West 57th Street, along Fifth Avenue. It was one of the great mansions of Gilded Age New York. Large, formal, and impossible to ignore, it looked more like a European chateau than an ordinary city residence. It stood at one of the most important corners in Manhattan, where the old private world of Fifth Avenue was coming face to face with a newer, more commercial city. For years, that house represented more than one family's wealth. It represented the confidence of an entire age. A time when the richest Americans believed they could build homes so grand that the city would have to remember them. A time when a family name could be written into the street itself through architecture. But by the 1920s, Fifth Avenue was no longer the same world that had welcomed those palaces. The avenue had grown busier. More commercial. More valuable. The old private houses were now surrounded by a city that wanted more from that land than one family residence could provide. That is when the meaning of the mansion began to change. It was still famous. It was still impressive. It was still tied to one of the most powerful names in American history. But in the eyes of the new Fifth Avenue, it was also sitting on land that could be used for something else. That is the brutal turn in this story. A palace did not have to become ugly to be destroyed. It did not have to become worthless. It only had to become less useful than what might replace it. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II house was demolished in 1926. The site was replaced by the Bergdorf Goodman building. That replacement tells the story almost perfectly. The avenue did not stop being wealthy. It did not stop being powerful. It did not stop attracting attention. But the form of wealth changed. A private palace gave way to a commercial landmark. A house built to display one family's status gave way to a business built to serve the new Fifth Avenue. Behind closed doors, the old mansion had once shown private power. Behind display windows, the new avenue showed commercial power. And that is why the loss feels so cold. The Vanderbilt mansion was not replaced because Fifth Avenue had fallen. It was replaced because Fifth Avenue had become even more valuable. The house did not fall because New York became poor. It fell because New York had found a richer use for the same ground. For the families who built those mansions, the homes had once answered a personal question: how do we prove who we are? But by the early 20th century, the city was asking a different question: what can this site become next? And once that question took over, even the Vanderbilt name was not enough. That is the emotional center of the whole story. We often assume that great wealth can protect anything. A family with enough money can build walls, hire architects, fill rooms with art, and place its name on the most important street in the city. But Fifth Avenue shows the limit of that power. Money could build the palace. But it could not force the next generation to keep it. It could not stop the neighborhood from changing. It could not stop buyers from seeing the land as more valuable than the house. It could not stop Manhattan from moving on. The Vanderbilt houses were built as if they would settle the family's place in New York forever. But forever is a dangerous word in a city like New York. One by one, the visible Vanderbilt presence on Fifth Avenue began to fade. Houses that had once announced the family's arrival were sold, demolished, or replaced. The name remained in history, but the buildings that had carried that name on the street began to disappear. And when a building disappears, something more than stone is lost. You lose the scale of the ambition. You lose the proof of how people once lived. You lose the physical evidence of a world that believed itself permanent. A photograph can show the outline. A record can preserve the date. But neither can fully replace standing in front of the building itself. That is why the demolition of these mansions still matters. Not because the families who lived there were innocent. They were not. Their wealth came from an age of hard industry, social inequality, and ruthless ambition. But the houses they left behind became part of the city's history, whether the city was ready to admit it or not. And when those houses were torn down, New York lost a visible chapter of itself. The most painful part is that the decision may have seemed practical at the time. A property was sold. A mansion was expensive to maintain. A commercial replacement made financial sense. The city needed to grow. The avenue was changing. Each explanation may be understandable by itself. But together, they created an enormous loss. That is how old Fifth Avenue disappeared. Not in one dramatic moment. Not with one villain. Not with one decision that everyone could point to and stop. It happened house by house. By the time people understood the size of what had been lost, many of the great mansions were already gone. That is what gives this part of the story its darkness. The wrecking ball was not the beginning of the destruction. It was the final step. The deeper damage had already happened when the mansion stopped being seen as a home, or a work of architecture, or a piece of the city's history, and started being seen mainly as a site. A site for something newer. A site for something taller. A site for something more profitable. That was the moment the palace was already in danger. Fifth Avenue had once helped the Vanderbilts look permanent. But in the end, the avenue proved that no private family could hold a city in place. The mansions had been built to say, "This name will last." New York answered in its own way. The name may last. The house may not. And that answer did not apply only to the Vanderbilts. It applied to much of Fifth Avenue's old mansion world. The palaces that survived had to find a different reason to remain. They had to become museums, institutions, or commercial landmarks. Because by then, beauty alone was not enough. A famous owner was not enough. A grand past was not enough. To survive on Fifth Avenue, a mansion needed a future. Not every palace on Fifth Avenue disappeared. A few still stand. But the important question is why? Because the survivors do not prove that Fifth Avenue protected its past. They prove something more complicated. They show that a mansion had a better chance of surviving if it stopped being only a private home. The survivors did not survive because they were loved. They survived because they became useful. That is the key to what remains. One of the clearest examples is the Frick Mansion. Henry Clay Frick was one of the major industrial figures of the Gilded Age, and his Fifth Avenue residence became one of the great surviving houses of that period. Today, the building is known as the Frick Collection. It is no longer simply remembered as a private home. It is a public museum, connected to art, education, and cultural memory. That change matters. The building survived not just as a reminder of one man's fortune, but as a place the public could enter. Rooms that once belonged to private life became rooms where visitors could stand and understand part of what that old world looked like. The Carnegie Mansion tells a similar story. Andrew Carnegie's former home still stands on Fifth Avenue, and today it houses Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian Design Museum. Like the Frick Mansion, it survived because it became more than a family residence. It became an institution. There is another kind of survivor, too. The former Morton Plant house at Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street is associated today with Cartier. It did not survive as a quiet family residence. It survived by becoming part of Fifth Avenue's luxury retail world. That is a different kind of preservation. Not a museum. Not the same public meaning as an institution. But it shows another path a mansion could take, adapt to the commercial future instead of being cleared away by it. And there is something almost ironic about that. The same commercial pressure that destroyed so many Fifth Avenue mansions helped preserve this one because the building could serve the new Fifth Avenue. It could still project luxury. It could still attract attention. It could still help sell an image. That is not a perfect victory. But it is not total loss either. It is a reminder that history sometimes survives in altered form. Not untouched. Not pure. Not exactly as the builders intended. But still visible. And that visibility matters. Because once a mansion is gone, the loss is hard to understand from the sidewalk. A modern building fills the space. The city keeps moving. People shop, work, cross the street, meet friends, and pass by without knowing what once stood there. The surviving buildings give the imagination something solid to hold on to. They let people see the scale. They let people feel the difference between a private palace and a modern commercial block. They prove the lost buildings were real. But the survivors can also mislead us if we are not careful. They can make the loss seem smaller than it was. Because if a visitor sees the Frick, or Carnegie's former mansion, or the old Plant house, it may be tempting to think old Fifth Avenue is still partly intact. But that is only a fragment of the truth. Most of that world is gone. The avenue that once held rows of private mansions became a different kind of street. Its wealth did not disappear, but its form changed. Private houses gave way to museums, stores, apartment buildings, offices, hotels, and towers. The city did not stop being rich. It simply stopped needing those palaces in the same way. That is why the few remaining mansions feel almost lonely. They stand as evidence. Evidence that Fifth Avenue once had a very different face. Evidence that American wealth once tried to dress itself in stone, ceremony, and European grandeur. Evidence that beauty alone was not enough to save the rest. And that is the harder point. If a mansion remained only a mansion, it was in danger. To survive, it often had to become something else. The few survivors are not proof that Fifth Avenue protected its past. They are proof that the past had to become useful before the city would let it remain. And now the final question becomes unavoidable. If the richest families in America could build these palaces, but still could not keep them standing, what does that say about wealth, legacy, and the kind of city Fifth Avenue had become? So why did Fifth Avenue's palaces disappear? Why did houses built by some of the richest families in America vanish from one of the most famous streets in the world? The answer is not one single event. Some houses were sold. Some became too expensive to maintain. Some stood on land that had become too valuable for a private residence. Some families changed. Some fortunes shifted. Some owners found that the old way of living no longer made sense. But the larger answer is clear. Money could build Fifth Avenue's palaces. Money could fill them with marble, art, carved wood, servants, ballrooms, and formal rooms meant to impress the city. But money alone could not save them. That is the truth at the center of this story. The families who built these mansions believed, in one way or another, that wealth could create permanence. They built houses large enough and grand enough to make their names feel fixed in New York. But New York was not fixed. The city kept moving. The avenue became more commercial. The land became more valuable. And over time, many of the mansions had to answer a question they were never designed to answer. What use do you serve now? For some, there was an answer. The Frick Mansion became a museum. The Carnegie Mansion became an institution. The former Morton Plant house adapted to Fifth Avenue's luxury retail world. Those buildings survived because they found a second life. But many others did not. They had been built for private families, private ceremonies, and a private world of status. When that world faded, the houses lost much of the reason people had protected them. Their beauty remained, but beauty was not always enough. Fifth Avenue's palaces were not erased because New York became poor. They were erased because New York kept becoming richer, busier, and more focused on the next use of valuable land. The avenue did not abandon wealth. It replaced one form of wealth with another. Private mansions gave way to stores, hotels, apartments, offices, museums, and institutions. The street remained powerful, but the old palace world disappeared. And by the time people understood how much had been lost, many of the buildings were already gone. That is how cities often lose their past. Not all at once. One sale at a time. One demolition permit at a time. One practical decision at a time. One building replaced by something that seemed to make more sense. No single decision explains the whole loss. But together, those decisions changed Fifth Avenue forever. The tragedy is not that New York changed. Cities have to change. New York has always been a city of movement, ambition, rebuilding, and reinvention. The tragedy is that so many of these houses were treated as disposable before enough people understood their value. They were private homes, but they were also pieces of the city's history. They showed how America's richest families wanted to be seen. They showed the confidence of the Gilded Age, the rivalry of New York society, and the belief that money could make a family permanent. But Fifth Avenue proved something different. A fortune can build a mansion. A famous name can fill it with meaning for a time. But a building survives only if the next generation believes it is worth keeping. For many of Fifth Avenue's palaces, that belief came too late. Today, a few survivors still give us a glimpse of the old avenue. They stand as reminders of a world that once seemed secure. But most of the private palaces are gone. Their addresses remain. Their photographs remain. Their stories remain. But the houses themselves are gone. And that is the final answer to the promise at the beginning. Fifth Avenue's palaces disappeared because the wealth that built them could not protect them from a city that wanted newer, more profitable uses for the land beneath them. They were built to prove permanence. Instead, they proved how temporary even great wealth can be. Old New York was not erased because it lacked money. It was erased because money kept deciding that something else mattered more. And that is the warning Fifth Avenue leaves behind. No mansion, no family name, no fortune, and no street is permanent unless people decide it is worth preserving before it is too late.